North Atlantic, January 1943. Grid AM-53, 300 miles west of Ireland, U-boat transit lane. The night was supposed to be their shield. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had slipped across the Atlantic under the cover of darkness, surfacing after sunset to recharge batteries, air out the boat, and send encrypted messages back to BDU headquarters. The crews trusted the night as if it were an old friend, predictable, loyal, silent. But on this night, in the freezing black emptiness west of Ireland, something felt wrong. Kappenleutnant Otto Kellerman stood on the conning tower of U-657, the icy wind tearing across his face as he scanned the horizon. Nothing moved except the waves. No moon, no stars, no aircraft, no escorts, no reason for unease, and yet the feeling persisted. A pressure behind the eyes, an instinct sharpened by months at sea. Someone is watching. Below, the radio man struggled with a burst of interference over the Enigma transmission channel. Static crackled violently in his headphones, a strange, rhythmic pulse unlike anything he had heard before. He tapped on the bulkhead. Herr Kalun, something is off with the signals. Kellerman dismissed it at first. Atmospheric disturbances were common in winter, but then he noticed the waves, illuminated in brief flashes of white as if brushed by distant lightning. Except there was no storm. Moments later, the hydrophone operator stiffened. Propellers, fast, approaching from above. Before Kellerman could shout the alarm, the sky erupted. A Halifax bomber of RAF Coastal Command tore out of the clouds, its searchlight snapping on like the eye of a god. The beam locked onto the U-boat instantly, not sweeping, not searching, but tracking, as if the aircraft already knew exactly where the submarine was. Kellerman froze. How? In this darkness? In this weather? Depth charges dropped in a perfect line. One after another, the sea detonated. As U-657 slipped beneath the surface, shaking violently, the truth finally reached Kellerman's mind. A truth the Kriegsmarine had refused to accept, a truth that would soon shatter the U-boat fleet. The night was no longer theirs. The Allies could see them now. For most of the war, German submarine doctrine relied on a simple assumption. Aircraft could not detect a U-boat at night unless it made noise or silhouette. Crews knew how to evade radar. They believed Allied sets were primitive, long wavelength, inaccurate, unable to track a small object like a conning tower unless the aircraft was almost on top of them. That assumption died in 1943. A quiet revolution had been unfolding in Britain, a scientific war waged in laboratories as fiercely as the battles at sea. Engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had perfected a new secret weapon, centimetric radar, operating at wavelengths so short that a submarine's periscope or snorkel cast a clear, sharp reflection. Its power was devastating. Unlike older radar systems, which used meter-long waves that washed over small shapes, centimetric radar could paint the ocean like a canvas. A U-boat conning tower was no longer a ghost. It was a bright, unmistakable spike on the operator's screen. Worse, the radar worked through darkness, fog, cloud banks, and storms. Suddenly, the North Atlantic, once the hunting ground of the U-boats, became a killing zone. Surface commanders noticed the change first. Boats that had sailed safely for months were now attacked on their very first patrol. Aircraft materialized from nowhere, perfectly aligned for the strike. U-boats that dove immediately were still hit, as if the enemy knew their exact course and depth. To the crews, it felt like magic, an invisible force exposing them. To Allied scientists, it was physics. To history, it was the moment the Battle of the Atlantic shifted forever. But in early 1943, the Germans did not yet understand the scale of what was coming. High command suspected new Allied tactics, perhaps improved signals intelligence. Admirals whispered about British code breaking, but Enigma was believed unbreakable. Others blamed careless radio discipline among captains. The truth, centimetric radar, remained unknown to most of the Kriegsmarine, and so U-boats continued to sail into the trap. By spring, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Navy had equipped dozens of long-range patrol aircraft with the new technology. Liberators, Wellingtons, Sunderlands, and Halifax bombers now patrolled the entire air gap. The once safe mid-Atlantic zone where no aircraft could reach. There were no safe zones anymore. U-657 survived the attack that night only by miracle, limping back toward France with a cracked pressure hull. Many others would not be so lucky. The new enemy, Invisible, silent, unstoppable, tightened its grip each week. The U-boat fleet did not know it yet, but history already had a name for what was coming: Black May. And once it arrived, the fate of the Atlantic and of the German submarine arm would never recover. Welcome to WWII Forgotten Fronts, a channel dedicated to the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the hidden machines that shaped the Second World War. Here we dive beyond the famous headlines to uncover stories buried in diaries, lost archives, and forgotten front lines. If you're passionate about deep storytelling, real wartime experiences, and cinematic history, you've just found your new home. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. RAF Coastal Command Operations Room, Plymouth, February 1943. Western approaches, North Atlantic. The operations room of RAF Coastal Command did not look like a battlefield. There were no cannons, no smoke, no blood, only chalkboards, map tables, and the quiet, relentless discipline of men and women fighting a scientific war. But in 1943, this unassuming room became the deadliest place in the world for German submarines. Flight Officer Margaret Hale stood over the North Atlantic plotting grid, sliding a small metal marker toward a convoy lane. Each marker represented a shadow detected by radar-equipped aircraft. Contacts that 6 months earlier would have been impossible to see. Now they appeared daily, sometimes hourly. Behind her, a sergeant read a new report from a Lee light-equipped Wellington bomber that had just landed. Radar contact at 2:17 hours, visual at 300 meters, target attempted crash dive, depth charges delivered, large oil slick observed. The officers exchanged no smiles, no cheers. They had seen too many convoys sunk, too many sailors killed in icy water. Victory, when it came, felt more like a grim necessity than triumph. But inside the minds of the German U-boat crews, something else was slowly brewing: fear. A weapon the Germans could not escape. By early 1943, centimetric radar was still so secret that even many British aircrew knew only fragments about how it worked. They called it the magic box, a modest, nondescript device that turned darkness into daylight. At wavelengths around 10 centimeters, this radar ignored the clutter that confused older systems. It didn't need a spotlight to search. It didn't care about weather. It carved out the shape of a U-boat on the ocean's surface with terrifying accuracy, like a knife cutting through cloth. A U-boat seen on centimetric radar could not hide by zigzagging. It could not hide under cloud cover. It could not hide by surfacing only briefly. It was simply seen, the most unforgivable sin in submarine warfare. Aircraft no longer had to locate a boat visually before attacking. They could approach undetected, throttling engines to mask sound, then dive like hawks onto prey. This new, invisible hunter had one mission: erase the U-boat threat before it erased Allied shipping. The first German clues in Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, the massive U-boat pens along the French coast, rumors began spreading among submarine crews. They're finding us in storms. They're finding us at night with no moon. They're finding us before we find them. Captain Zerzay Helmut Hai, one of the more respected observers within the Kriegsmarine, wrote privately, "The enemy now sees us with a precision that defies logic. Something fundamental has changed." But Dönitz, head of the U-boat arm, refused to accept the scale of the danger. Not out of arrogance, but because he believed, as many Germans did, that they were still one breakthrough away from turning the Atlantic back into a hunting ground. New torpedoes, improved WOLFPACKS, bolder tactics. Yet none of these mattered anymore, because centimetric radar changed not tactics, but physics, the very environment in which submarines lived. The sea was no longer a shield. The night was no longer a cloak. The weather was no longer an ally. U-boats were naked, a tide beginning to turn. On the Allied side, confidence was rising, cautiously. The Admiralty had been burned before by premature optimism. Convoys were still being sunk. WOLFPACKS still gathered in frightening numbers. The Atlantic remained vast, unpredictable, cruel. But patterns were changing. For the first time in the war, more U-boats were being destroyed than could be built. For the first time, U-boat patrols were ending sooner. Not from victory, but from being hunted. For the first time, German captains who once forced convoys to scatter were now the ones fleeing. In the early hours of February 12, 1943, a Liberator patrol aircraft encountered U-632. Radar lock was instant. Attack run flawless. The submarine never even attempted to dive. The crew later admitted in debrief, "We don't know how they found us. We never saw them." For the U-boat arm, that sentence was the beginning of the end. The psychological collapse begins inside the steel coffin of a Type C submarine. Life was already brutal. Limited air, sweat dripping down bulkheads, diesel fumes mixing with mold, weeks without sunlight. But nothing was worse than uncertainty. Before centimetric radar, the crew believed they understood the rules of survival. If they remained silent, stayed submerged during daylight, and surfaced only when the night was thick and the clouds heavy, they were safe. Now, every surface felt suicidal. Every dark horizon felt like a lie. Every wave could be hiding a bomber following an invisible trail. Veteran Commander Peter Eric Creamer described the mood. The men stared at the sky as if it were no longer the sky, but a vast radar screen hunting us. The psychological shift was profound. Fear broke discipline. Exhaustion hollowed morale. Captains grew cautious, too cautious. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Germans had no idea that the worst month in their history, Black May, was only weeks away. Malvern, England, February-March 1943. Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE. Long before centimetric radar hunted U-boats across the night sky, its war began here, in an old country estate converted into the most advanced scientific battlefield of World War II. The buildings at Malvern were unremarkable, but inside them worked a collection of minds unlike anything Germany ever faced. Physicists, mathematicians, engineers, and eccentric geniuses who barely knew military protocol, but understood the language of waves, energy, and electronics with surgical precision. They were the men and women behind the invisible enemy. Among them was Dr. Bernard Lovell, a young physicist with an obsessive fascination for short-wavelength radiation. He once joked that the war had given him an excuse to play with toys far too expensive for a university. Yet his experiments, conducted with coffee-fueled nights and chalk-dusted lab coats, would alter the fate of the Atlantic. Because he and his colleagues had done the impossible. They made radar small enough, sharp enough, and powerful enough to fit inside an aircraft and find a submarine in the dark. Why it worked, and why Germany had no chance to counter it. The brilliance of centimetric radar wasn't just in its engineering, it was in how profoundly it broke the assumptions of German naval doctrine. Traditional German radar detection devices like MATOX and later Naxos were designed to pick up older Allied radar signals in the long meter bands. They worked reasonably well in 1941 and 1942, giving U-boats crucial seconds to dive when an aircraft approached. But Lovell's creation emitted signals at wavelengths the Germans had never planned for, frequencies so short, so concentrated, and so precise that early warning detectors couldn't hear them at all. To a U-boat, centimetric radar was silent. The first warning a commander received was the roar of a descending bomber. The second was the sea exploding around him. German scientists eventually understood what was happening, but by then, it was far too late. Donitz demanded countermeasures. Research teams scrambled. Engineers tore apart captured Allied sets. But the technology gap was brutally wide. Centimetric radar had become industrialized before Germany even suspected it existed. It was as if the Allies had skipped several chapters of technological evolution in a single leap. A new kind of war, intelligence, technology, industry. In 1943, the war at sea was no longer just about ships and submarines. It was a synergy, a fusion of three forces. Intelligence, ultra-decrypts and HF-DF radio fixes gave the Allies strategic vision. Technology, centimetric radar gave them tactical precision. Industry, American mass production gave them overwhelming volume. The combination was lethal. Aircraft factories produced long-range liberators faster than U-boats could sink merchant ships. Radar units were installed on new planes in weeks, not months. And every improvement in radar range or clarity translated into more submarines destroyed. Meanwhile, Germany was drowning in shortages. Shortages of experienced crews, shortages of fuel, shortages of repair capacity, shortages of replacement boats, shortages of time. The war had become a technological sprint, and Germany had begun several laps behind. Inside the U-boat pens, quiet panic, In Brest and Lorient, the atmosphere among U-boat crews was changing. The concrete pens, once symbols of invincibility, now felt like tombs waiting to be filled. In February 1943, a crew returning from patrol met a group of fresh sailors heading out. One veteran whispered as they passed, "The sea isn't ours anymore." The newcomers laughed nervously, believing it a dark joke. But the older men didn't laugh back. Whenever a U-boat limped home with battle damage, the officers gathered in smoky briefings inside command bunkers. There, captains exchanged stories. They struck out of total cloud cover. The radar lock was instantaneous. METOCs never made a sound. They attacked us in the middle of a storm. They found us before we ever found them. One officer described the sensation perfectly. It was as if the sky itself had learned to listen. Dönitz demanded answers, but his signals officers had none. Radar? Possibly. New code breaking? Perhaps. Better reconnaissance? Likely. But nobody guessed the truth. An entirely new spectrum of electromagnetic warfare had entered the battlefield. The final clue: a submarine that never should have been seen. The event that convinced German scientists something was catastrophically wrong came in March 1943. U-403 had surfaced in the middle of a violent Atlantic squall. Visibility was zero. Winds howled at 50 knots. The sea was chaos. No aircraft could possibly operate in such conditions. And yet, one found them. The first glimpse the crew saw was a shape descending from the storm, not searching, not circling, but flying directly at them. Depth charges followed immediately. The boat barely survived. When the captain returned and filed his report, German analysts were shaken. Impossible weather, impossible visibility, impossible accuracy. This was no longer improved Allied tactics. This was not luck. This was a new weapon, but they still had no idea how devastatingly advanced it was, or how widely it had already spread across Allied air fleets. The scientific blow had landed. Germany simply had not realized it yet. The Atlantic was nearing a breaking point. Black May was approaching, and the Kriegsmarine was walking into it blind. North Atlantic, March-April 1943. Convoy routes, HX and SC lanes, mid-ocean. The WOLFPACKS were gathering again. After months of mounting losses and confusing reports from returning U-boats, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz made a bold decision. He would prove, to himself, to Hitler, and to the entire Kriegsmarine, that the U-boat arms still held the power to choke Britain into submission. His logic was simple, and for years it had been correct. Concentrate the U-boats. Find the convoy. Overwhelm the escorts, sink the merchant fleet. This formula had brought Britain to the brink of starvation in 1942. But in early 1943, the sea itself had changed. The battlefield had changed. The very rules had changed. Dönitz just didn't know it yet. And so he sent his WOLFPACKS out, dozens of U-boats forming lines hundreds of miles long, waiting like steel predators for the scent of Allied shipping. What they did not realize was that every line, every formation, every attempt at coordinated attack was now being silently observed by their enemies. Because centimetric radar was only one blade of the knife. The other was intelligence. The Allies could see the WOLFPACKS before the WOLFPACKS saw themselves. In the spring of 1943, three forces converged to break the back of the U-boat fleet. 1. Ultra-decrypt's British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had once again broken key portions of Enigma naval traffic. They knew U-boat patrol zones, refueling schedules, and assembly points, often before the U-boat captains themselves. 2. HFDF radio fixes, Huff Duff. Every time a U-boat sent a message, even for seconds, Allied direction-finding stations triangulated their positions. The Germans believed Enigma protected them. They never understood that the signal itself, not the encryption, was giving them away. 3. Centimetric radar aircraft no longer searched. They located, they attacked, they destroyed. When combined, these three technologies formed a perfect killing system. The Allies didn't just react to U-boat movements, they anticipated them, striking before WOLFPACKS could assemble, breaking attacks before they began. It was the closest thing World War II ever saw to real-time battlefield omniscience. The first WOLFPACK collapses in late March. WOLFPACK Seawolf finally detected convoy SC-122 and prepared the traditional night surface attack, the tactic that once caused escort commanders to panic. But as U-221 crept toward the convoy, radar-equipped liberators detected the submarine long before it reached firing position. The aircraft swooped in silently. The first sign the crew noticed was the ocean exploding around them. U-221 dove, but it was too late. The bombers followed their descent with sonar and radar, dropping charges along the exact escape course. Minutes later, the boat sank with all hands. Across the patrol line, other submarines tried to close in, but the same nightmare repeated itself. Every U-boat attempting to approach the convoy was detected, isolated, hunted, destroyed, or forced to break off the attack. The Wolfpack never had a chance to assemble. Donitz received the after-action reports and stared in disbelief. How can the enemy attack us in storms? In darkness? Without warning? No one had an answer. Convoy ONS-5, the last U-boat victory, turns into a defeat. In late April 1943, the largest battle of the Atlantic War erupted around Convoy ONS-5. It began like the great Wolfpack victories of the past. U-boats converged from multiple directions. Escorts fought desperately. Several merchant ships were sunk. For a moment, it seemed as if the old days had returned. But then the Allies unleashed their new weapons. A dense screen of radar-equipped aircraft, Wellingtons by day, Liberators and Sunderlands by night, began sweeping the seas around the convoy. Every radar contact was attacked within minutes. Ships equipped with centimetric radar detected periscopes. Escort groups coordinated depth charge patterns with precision impossible only months earlier. The U-boats, once the hunters, became targets. One after another, they were hit. U-630, U-531, U-209, U-258, U-710, crews who escaped the sinking boats reported the same chilling detail. The enemy knew where we were before we knew where they were. The tables had turned so sharply, so violently, that the U-boat commanders were psychologically stunned. A Wolfpack commander breaks down. Kapitän-Leutnant Jürgen Osten, one of the more skilled submarine officers, confessed in his patrol diary, "It is no longer a battle. It is a slaughter. We surface, and the sky attacks. We dive, and the sea cracks open. Where is the enemy? Everywhere." Across the fleet, commanders sent desperate messages requesting new orders, new tactics, anything. But Donitz had nothing to offer. There were no tactics for fighting an enemy that could see through clouds and darkness. There were no maneuvers to escape a radar beam. There were no countermeasures that could bridge a technological gulf measured in years. The Wolfpacks continued to operate, but the sea had turned against them. A trap was closing, a trap they could neither see nor escape. And in May 1943, it would snap shut with devastating finality. Black May was about to begin. May 1 to 31st, 1943. North Atlantic, the month the U-boat force broke. The North Atlantic in May 1943 was not a battlefield. It was an execution ground. For years, German U-boats had sailed these waters with predatory confidence. Their morale had fluctuated, their tactics had evolved, but their identity remained. They were the hunters. They chose when to strike, when to disappear, when to stalk. But in May 1943, everything inverted. The hunter became prey. The ocean became a trap. The sky became an executioner. Decades later, naval historians would call it the turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Not a symbolic shift, but a violent, statistical collapse so catastrophic that even Donitz privately conceded defeat. This was Black May, the month the U-boat arm died. The numbers that broke the Kriegsmarine. 41 U-boats were destroyed in a single month. Let the scale settle in. This wasn't merely high casualties. This was annihilation. 1 in every 4 U-boats at sea was lost. Crew survival rates plummeted to below 30%. Many boats vanished without any distress call at all, simply erased. Germany could not replace the boats fast enough. But more critically, Germany could not replace the men. Every U-boat lost was not just steel sinking. It was the death of highly trained specialists who required years to develop. Navigators, hydrophone operators, radiomen, torpedo officers, machinists, experienced commanders. The Kriegsmarine had invested irreplaceable time and expertise in these crews. And in May 1943, that experience disappeared into the Atlantic, boat by boat. Why the casualties were so extreme? The U-boats weren't being outnumbered. They weren't being outmaneuvered. They were being outseen. Centimetric radar, spread widely across Allied long-range aircraft by May, spotted U-boats at distances and angles once considered impossible. A conning tower punching through the surface for even seconds was enough. A periscope was enough. A snorkel was enough. Sometimes, even the turbulence left by a diving boat was enough. RAF Coastal Command pilots spoke later with a mixture of shock and disbelief at how effective the technology had become. It felt unfair. We saw them before they had any idea we were there. Whenever a radar operator called out a contact, the procedure was ruthlessly efficient. Approach from cloud cover or from behind the moon. Cut throttle to reduce noise. Descend at high speed. Illuminate with the lee light during the final seconds. Drop depth charges exactly along the U-boat's projected dive path. The Germans could not predict it. They could not counter it. They could not hide from it. U-boat crews crack under the strain. In Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, the atmosphere in the U-boat pens shifted from determination to dread. Veteran captains avoided eye contact with new recruits. Sailors whispered superstitions about cursed waters and ghost planes. Letters home became darker, more fatalistic. One returned commander wrote simply, "We go out, they wait, we die." Psychologists later studying U-boat morale noted 3 overwhelming emotional fractures. 1, loss of control. Submarine warfare depends on stealth and initiative. Black May stripped U-boat crews of both. 2, unseen threats. Humans fear what they cannot perceive. Radar made the enemy omnipresent, a terror born from invisibility. 3, survival, hopelessness. Crews knew losses were extreme. They knew patrols had become near suicidal. Some entered the boat already believing they would never return. The psychological collapse was as deadly as Allied bombs. The day Donitz realized the war had turned on May 24, 1943, Donitz received a set of reports so grim that even the seasoned admiral, a man who had built the entire U-boat arm, fell silent. Boat after boat had gone missing. Entire WOLFPACKS had disintegrated. Attack routes that once guaranteed kills were now death corridors. When he met with Hitler that evening, Donitz did the unthinkable. He recommended withdrawing the U-boats from the North Atlantic. This was not a strategic adjustment. It was an admission of irreversible defeat. The key sentence from his report read, "The enemy air weapon, empowered by new detection methods, has rendered our operations in the North Atlantic untenable." New detection methods. He didn't yet understand their technical nature, but the effects were undeniable. Hitler agreed. For the first time in the war, the U-boat war was halted. The WOLFPACKS were ordered south, away from the critical convoy lanes, away from the North Atlantic, away from the decisive theater of the war. Victory in the Battle of the Atlantic passed permanently to the Allies. A German captain's final entry. Among the personal diaries recovered after the war was a chilling final note from Kapitänleutnant Heinz Eckhard, written days before his boat vanished. "We are no longer submariners. We are shadows fleeing from a sky that knows our names." That sentence, raw, poetic, broken, captured the truth of Black May with devastating clarity. The Atlantic had turned against Germany. The invisible enemy, centimetric radar, had triumphed. The U-boat arm, once the terror of the ocean, had been undone not by torpedoes, but by waves of light the human eye could not see. Black May had ended. The U-boat war would never recover. June-September 1943. Berlin, Kiel, Lorient, and the North Atlantic periphery. Black May had shattered the U-boat fleet, but it had not yet broken German pride. In the corridors of the German Naval Command in Berlin, officers scrambled through reports, desperate to identify how their once-feared submarine arm had collapsed so quickly. They blamed Allied air superiority, improved convoy escorts, long-range patrols, careless captains, British code-breaking, anything that felt familiar. But the real cause remained hidden, like the weapon itself, centimetric radar. Now the Germans faced a question they had never imagined confronting so soon. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, cannot detect, and cannot escape? The first signs of the truth. In early June 1943, fragments of intelligence began trickling into the Kriegsmarine research office. A downed British bomber in the Bay of Biscay revealed a radar unit unlike anything previously identified. Compact, powerful, tuned to wavelengths that German detectors were blind to. The device was transported under heavy guard to Berlin, where engineers stared at it with disbelief. One wrote in his report, "The physics suggest a wavelength so short it is beyond the range of our current detection systems." For the first time, the possibility of a new Allied radar type became undeniable. Donitz ordered an emergency meeting at Kerneval Bunker in Lorient. Officers gathered around a table covered with maps, casualty charts, and fragments of captured technology. The admiral looked exhausted, older than the war had any right to make him. "We are not being hunted by aircraft," he said quietly. "We are being hunted by something inside the aircraft." This was the moment the Kriegsmarine finally understood the scale of the crisis. But understanding did not mean they knew how to solve it. Countermeasure number 1, the Naxos detector, too little too late. German scientists rushed to create a detector that could pick up 10-centimeter radar emissions. The first prototypes, codenamed Naxos U, arrived at U-boat pens by late summer. But the device was deeply flawed. It could only detect radar when the aircraft was already dangerously close. It required the U-boat to expose a fragile antenna while surfaced. Its range was so short that it often gave mere seconds of warning. It was useless against aircraft approaching low or from cloud cover. Most damning, Allied radar was improving faster than German detectors could adapt. A weapon that evolves monthly will always outrun a defense that takes years to refine. Countermeasure number 2, new submarine designs, too slow. Realizing the Type 7 and Type 9 submarines were too vulnerable, German engineers proposed dramatic solutions. The Walter U-boat, Type Thefit, a hydrogen peroxide-powered submarine capable of 20-plus knots underwater, fast enough to evade radar-guided aircraft. The ELEKTROBOOT, Type X-Wine, a revolutionary all-electric submarine designed for prolonged submerged operation with a sleek hull and rapid underwater speed. These were extraordinary concepts, decades ahead of their time. But they faced insurmountable obstacles. Raw materials were scarce. Factories were bombed relentlessly. Skilled labor was disappearing to the Eastern Front. Hitler constantly interfered, demanding rushed timelines and impossible requirements. By the time the Type X-1 finally entered limited service in 1945, the war was already lost. The most advanced submarine of the war arrived 2 years too late. Countermeasure number 3, tactical adjustments, ineffective. Donitz issued new orders: avoid surfacing at night, remain submerged during dusk and dawn, cross the Bay of Biscay at maximum speed, use snorkels whenever possible. But snorkels were noisy, fragile, and created a distinctive wake easily spotted by radar-equipped aircraft. Submerged speed was slow, battery life was limited, and worst of all, the Allies had radar that could detect snorkels and periscopes. Crews reported terrifying encounters. "We were at snorkel depth. They still found us. We never saw the aircraft until the bombs hit. There is no tactic that can save us." The U-boat arm was bleeding to death. Countermeasure number 4, move the war to new waters, a temporary illusion. Unable to survive in the North Atlantic, Donitz shifted U-boat operations to the South Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, the waters off West Africa, the Mid-Atlantic refueling zones. For a brief moment, sinkings increased. But this was not a resurgence. It was a delay. Allied long-range aircraft soon extended patrol coverage into these regions. Escort carriers roamed previously safe waters. New radar installations were fitted to destroyer escorts and even merchant ships. Nowhere was safe. Not the tropics. Not the southern seas. Not the mid-ocean. Not even the approaches to French ports. The psychological toll deepens. A sense of fatalism began to consume the U-boat arm. One chief engineer wrote, "When I hear engines now, I do not think of the enemy. I think of my own funeral." Young recruits entering training schools sensed the fear in their instructors. Veterans stopped telling sea stories. The heroic propaganda posters in U-boat pens felt like relics from another war. Above all, crews resented the truth they could not say aloud. They were being sent back into a fight their leaders no longer believed they could win. Donitz faces reality. By September 1943, Donitz admitted to his staff what he could not yet say publicly. "We have no counter to their radar. Until we do, our boats are being sacrificed." He was right. And though Germany would continue sending submarines into the Atlantic until 1945, they would never again threaten Allied shipping as they had in 1942. Black May had broken the U-boat force. Now the aftermath was breaking its soul. June-December 1943. Bay of Biscay, Atlantic approaches to France. For U-boat crews, the Bay of Biscay was once a gateway, the final stretch of water before reaching the wide, hunting-rich Atlantic. Crews treated it like a border crossing. Dangerous, yes, but manageable. Once they were through, they believed freedom awaited. But in the second half of 1943, the Biscay was transformed into something else entirely: a slaughterhouse. Allied commanders understood something the Germans had overlooked. Every U-boat, no matter how stealthy, had to leave and return through the BISCAY. It was the submarine fleet's throat, and the Allies were ready to squeeze. Allied air power is unleashed. By late 1943, the RAF and U.S. Navy had flooded the BISCAY with long-range aircraft. Liberators from 53, 224, and 311 Squadron Sunderlands, from 10 and 201 squadrons, Wellingtons armed with Lee Light's Beaufighters with rockets, Mosquitoes hunting at high speed. The air patrols were relentless, 24 hours a day in all weather with overlapping radar coverage with aircraft rotating to seal gaps. The BISCAY wasn't just watched, it was saturated. Aircraft didn't search, they waited. They didn't stumble upon U-boats. U-boats entered their kill zone. The Allies had turned the bay into a vast aerial minefield, except the mines were radar-equipped bombers. The Germans try a new tactic, fight on the surface. Dönitz, desperate to regain the initiative, issued one of the most dangerous orders of the war. U-boats were to remain on the surface and fight incoming aircraft. His reasoning was brutal but logical. A diving U-boat was predictable. Aircraft could easily adjust attack runs to match its dive path. Centimetric radar made diving safer for the aircraft, not the submarine. Anti-aircraft guns were the only tool the Germans had left. So U-boats began sailing in flak traps, groups of submarines armed with heavy anti-aircraft weapons designed to ambush Allied aircraft. This tactic had immediate and catastrophic consequences. The first battles, a brief hope. In July 1943, U-333 under Peter Erich Kremer shot down a Sunderland flying boat. Another boat, U-441, heavily modified as a flak U-boat, engaged several aircraft in a series of violent surface battles. For a moment, German propaganda celebrated a comeback. Posters showed heroic crews firing at the sky, bringing down the air wolves that hunted them. But hope died quickly. Aircraft learned to keep distance. Radar gave them early warning. Beaufighters fired rockets from beyond the range of U-boat guns. The flak U-boats were mauled. U-441, once hailed as the prototype of a new era, was nearly destroyed on its next patrol. Its captain begged Dönitz to abandon the concept. Surface combat had become suicide. The BISCAY turns into a graveyard. Between June and December 1943, the BISCAY became the deadliest waters on Earth for U-boats. Aircraft sank boats in. Darkness, storms, dense fog, broad daylight under heavy cloud cover, even when submarines attempted coordinated flak defenses. A chilling pattern emerged. A U-boat left its pen. It crossed the BISCAY. It was detected by radar. Within minutes, an aircraft arrived. The attack was precise, violent, and often fatal. Some boats were sunk within an hour of leaving port. The U-boat bases received so many boat missing, presumed lost messages that officers stopped reading them aloud. A survivor's account. The sky was watching us. One of the few BISCAY survivors, a machinist from U-621, described the horror. We surfaced at night. The waves were high. No moon. No stars. And then light. Blinding light. The aircraft came out of nothing. The radar had seen us before nature itself could see us. He went on. We fired everything we had. The ocean around us burned. But they attacked from every angle, guided by something we could not sense. U-621 barely survived, limping back with fires on deck and half the crew wounded. Most boats were not so fortunate. The BISCAY equation, a strategic nightmare for Germany. U-boats needed to cross the BISCAY to reach the Atlantic. The Allies knew this, and centimetric radar made ambush trivial. No matter how quietly a U-boat sailed, no matter how dark the night, no matter how stormy the weather, radar pierced everything. German analysts finally admitted the Bay of Biscay is no longer a transit zone. It is an Allied kill zone. The Germans tried to route boats farther south. They tried high-speed dashes. They tried creeping along the coast. They tried group formations. They tried surface battles. Nothing worked. Every tactic crumbled under the invisible force the Germans still struggled to describe. The radar that turned the sky into a hunter. The psychological collapse deepens. By autumn, the BISCAY had become so feared that crews nicknamed it the Gate of Death, the Airwolves Corridor, the White Line of No Return. New recruits kept asking the same question. What happens when they find us? Veterans always replied with silence. Some crews drank heavily the night before departure. Others wrote farewell letters they never intended to send, confident they wouldn't survive. The bravest among them confessed, "We are no longer sailors. "We are sacrifices." The Biscay was no longer a sea. It was a verdict, and Germany had no strategy left that could reverse it. Late 1943, early 1944. North Atlantic convoy routes, Coastal Command HQ, Allied shipyards. By late 1943, the transformation of the Atlantic was complete. 2 years earlier, convoys had sailed in terror, scattering at the mere rumor of a U-boat wolfpack. Merchant sailors prayed, escorts fought desperately, and entire formations sometimes vanished overnight into a sea lit by burning oil. Now the fear had reversed. The Atlantic was no longer the U-boat's hunting ground. It was an Allied highway, paved with air power, intelligence, and industrial might. Convoys no longer fled the wolfpacks. The wolfpacks fled the convoys. It was the most dramatic reversal of dominance in the entire maritime history of the war. The Allies achieved what was once impossible: full air coverage. For most of the war, the air gap, a vast central region of the Atlantic unreachable by Allied aircraft, had been the playground of the U-boat arm. Wolfpacks lurked there with impunity. But by late 1943, the air gap had vanished. How the Allies closed it. Very long-range liberators capable of patrols exceeding 2,000 miles, equipped with centimetric radar, lee lights, and homing depth charges. Escort carriers, baby flat-tops. Small aircraft carriers built rapidly in American shipyards. Each convoy group now had its own air wing to cover the entire crossing. U-boats could no longer surface safely, even in mid-ocean. Expanded Coastal Command networks, radar stations, direction-finding bases, and intelligence nodes covering all submarine transit lanes. Improved weather reconnaissance aircraft, allowing patrols to intercept U-boats even in storms. The Atlantic, once a vast, unpatrollable wilderness, had become a surveilled and mapped battlespace. One U-boat commander said it best: "Wherever we surfaced, the enemy already waited." Convoys transformed from victims to predators. Even convoy escorts, once viewed as defensive, became offensive hunters. Destroyer escorts with centimetric radar. Small, fast, mass-produced warships equipped with forward-throwing hedgehog mortars, high-precision radar sonar that could track U-boats even during evasive dives, improved depth charge patterns. These escorts could now attack submerged submarines directly and repeatedly without losing contact. Tracking without eyes radar allowed escorts to see a U-boat's periscope at remarkable distances, catch snorkels breaking the surface, monitor diving patterns, coordinate attacks with aircraft overhead. One destroyer escort officer wrote, "We were no longer chasing ghosts. The radar turned the ocean into glass." American industry becomes a weapon. By 1943 to 44, American shipyards were launching new vessels at a rate the Germans could not comprehend. Liberty ships, merchant ships, sometimes completed in under 40 days. Destroyer escorts rolled out continuously. Escort carriers, nearly one per month. Aircraft production, tens of thousands per year. Radar units, standardized, modular, mass-producible. Germany built U-boats one by one. The Allies built fleets. Even if a U-boat slipped through the hunting net, sank a merchant ship, and escaped, its victory was meaningless. The Allies replaced losses faster than the Kriegsmarine could inflict them. It was like trying to kill a hydra by cutting off a single head. Meanwhile, every U-boat destroyed represented years of training, lost a shrinking pool of veterans, a collapse in morale, a dwindling industrial supply chain. The Battle of the Atlantic was now a war of numbers, and Germany's numbers were doomed. U-boat attacks become rare and desperate. By the winter of 1943 to 44, most U-boat attacks ended in failure. Why the U-boats could no longer score victories? Surfacing was suicidal. Diving was predictable. Snorkels gave away positions. Convoy escorts were faster and more accurate. Aircraft arrived within minutes of radar contact. Allied intelligence knew U-boat departure points and routes. In the past, a single U-boat could terrorize a convoy. Now, even coordinated attacks collapsed instantly under Allied detection systems. Most U-boat commanders stopped hunting. They focused only on survival, often taking absurd risks just to avoid aircraft. One reported, "We spent more time dodging than attacking. The sea was hostile. The sky was fatal." The U-boat fleet shrinks into retreat. By early 1944, U-boat construction slowed. Training schools were half empty. Veterans were nearly gone. New crews were inexperienced teenagers. Donitz no longer believed in victory, only endurance. Instead of hunting convoys, U-boats now patrolled safer waters or tried to interdict distant Allied supply lines in marginal theaters. But their relevance had evaporated. The once feared Atlantic blockade was dead. The Allies declare strategic victory. In February 1944, Admiral Sir Max Horton of Western Approaches Command delivered the assessment that had been unthinkable 2 years earlier. The U-boat threat has been mastered, not reduced, not contained, not weakened, mastered. The sea lanes, lifelines between North America and Europe, were securely in Allied hands. Shipping losses plummeted to near pre-war levels. Supplies for D-Day crossed the Atlantic safely in vast convoys protected by radar-equipped escort carriers and air groups. The greatest submarine threat in naval history had been defeated. Not by luck, not by superior numbers alone, but by a fusion of scientific innovation, intelligence, dominance, overwhelming industry, strategic discipline, and an entirely new type of warfare. The Allies had turned the Atlantic from a battlefield into a superhighway of victory. 1943 to 1944. Aboard Type 7 and 9 U-boats, French Atlantic pens, Kiel training schools. Long before the last torpedo was fired, the U-boat war had already been lost inside the minds of the men who fought it. For these submarine crews, once hailed as the elite of the Reich, adored by propaganda films, and celebrated as the wolves of the Atlantic, the psychological unraveling that followed Black May was brutal, intimate, and quiet. It began with whispers. It ended with resignation. By late 1943, the legendary confidence of the U-boat arm had collapsed into something raw and painful, the knowledge that they were being sent to die. Inside a Type 7, a steel coffin in slow-motion life, aboard a U-boat was always harsh, even in the glory days of 1940-41. But after mid-1943, it became almost unbearable. Inside a submarine, humidity approached 90%, mold clung to every surface. Diesel fumes coated the crew's lungs. Fresh water was rationed so tightly that some men didn't wash for weeks. Toilets overflowed frequently, bunks were shared hotbed style. One man woke up as another lay down, food rotted halfway through patrol. Electrical insulation flaked and caused shocks, valves hissed ominously in their sleep cycles. The hull creaked like a living animal, and all of it took place in perpetual darkness, or red emergency lighting. But none of these discomforts compared to the new, omnipresent fear, the knowledge that aircraft could find them anywhere, anytime. One navigator wrote in his diary, "We live in a can of metal, and the sky can open it whenever it wishes." The first crack, no more safe hours. Before centimetric radar, U-boat captains trusted certain rules. Dive during the day, safe. Surface at night, safe. Use cloud cover, safe. Storm, safe. Fog, safe. Heavy rain, safe. After 1943, none of these were true. A hydrophone operator described the shift. Every time we surfaced, we asked, "Is this the moment the sky kills us?" Crewmen flinched at every sound. Engines throttling down meant danger. Unexpected vibrations meant danger. Static on the radio meant danger. Fear became their constant companion, a silent crew member no one dared mention. Letters home become farewells. Surviving U-boat letters collected after the war reveal a heartbreaking pattern. Before 1943, men wrote about victory, comradeship, pride, excitement, duty. After 1943, their letters changed tone. Confessions, regrets, instructions for families, acceptance of death. One radio man wrote to his fiancée, "If this letter reaches you, it means the sea has taken me. Do not mourn long. They hunted us like we were already dead." These were not the words of warriors preparing for battle. These were the words of men preparing for burial at sea. Training schools become silent halls. At the training base in Kiel, instructors no longer spoke with fire or optimism. Recruit classes shrank. Veteran officers avoided looking new recruits in the eyes. Everyone knew survival odds. Drills continued, torpedo loading, damage control, crash dives, but the energy was different. No one believed skill mattered anymore. A recruit once asked his instructor, "Herr Leutnant, what is the safest depth?" The instructor paused, then replied, "Home." The classroom laughed nervously, but it was not a joke. Mutiny without rebellion, silent resistance. Contrary to myth, there were no open mutinies in the U-boat arm. Men followed orders, kept discipline, and performed their duties. But below the surface, a different kind of resistance brewed. Hesitation, dread fatalism, mechanical obedience. Instead of belief, lack of initiative, absence of aggression. crews no longer urged their captains to attack. They urged them to survive. A veteran petty officer said years later, "We did our duty, but we no longer did the job." It was a subtle collapse, quiet but irreversible. The crushing statistic every crew knew. By the end of 1943, the numbers were undeniable. A U-boat crewman had a higher chance of dying than any other German serviceman. By 1944, only 1 in 4 would return from patrol. More than 28,000 of 40,000 U-boat sailors would die, a staggering 70% mortality rate. No branch in any navy in modern history suffered losses this catastrophic. Submariners understood this intimately. Every funeral at sea reinforced it. Every empty bunk reinforced it. Every new face in the pens, replacing a lost crew, reinforced it. Death wasn't a possibility. It was a schedule. Dönitz tries to keep spirits alive, but he knows the truth. Dönitz, for all his ruthlessness, deeply cared for his men. He visited pens personally, shook hands, spoke to crews, delivered speeches of courage. But even he could not disguise the fear in his own eyes. He stopped promising victory. He stopped predicting breakthroughs. His speeches became more about endurance, fate, and sacrifice. One officer recalled, "He no longer inspired us. He mourned us before we were gone." The final blow, when hope dies. The psychological collapse of the U-boat arm peaked in early 1944. Crews no longer asked, "How many ships will we sink?" They asked, "How close to France can we stay? How long until aircraft find us? Will we see home again?" This was the death of morale, the quiet, invisible destruction that matched the invisible radar hunting them. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a struggle of machines and tactics. It was a war fought inside the hearts of the men trapped between steel walls and a sky full of unseen hunters. By the time D-Day approached, the U-boat arm was no longer a weapon. It was a tragedy. 1943 to 1945. German naval yards at Kiel, Bremen, Hamburg, design bureaus, surviving U-boat pens. Great powers do not accept strategic defeat easily, and the Kriegsmarine was no exception. Even as U-boats were being lost at unprecedented rates, Germany's scientists and naval engineers were racing to produce a miracle, a technological salvation that could reverse the collapse of the Atlantic campaign. That salvation had a name whispered through design bureaus and submarine pens like a promise: ELEKTROBOOT, the Type XE1. A submarine so advanced it did not belong to 1944. It belonged to the future. But like so many German wonder weapons, it was born too late, deployed too slowly, and sabotaged by the collapsing Reich around it. The ELEKTROBOOT was a masterpiece, but it could not save a war already drowned beneath the waves. The vision: a submarine that lived underwater. Traditional U-boats were surface vessels that could submerge. The ELEKTROBOOT was the opposite, a vessel designed to live submerged. For decades, submarine warfare had revolved around surfacing to recharge, surfacing to communicate, surfacing to attack, surfacing to cross long distances. Every surfacing made a U-boat vulnerable, especially to centimetric radar. The Type XE1 aimed to eliminate the need to surface at all. Revolutionary features: hydrodynamic hull modeled after research in high-speed underwater drag. Powerful electric engines allowing sustained submerged speeds of 15 to 17 knots. Snorkel system integrated from design stage, not as an add-on. Huge battery banks triple the size of Type 7 boats. Silent running capabilities far beyond existing German subs. Automated torpedo reloads, firing 6 torpedoes in minutes. Range and endurance never before achieved underwater. To Allied radar aircraft, such a boat would be nearly invisible. To escorts, nearly impossible to catch. This was not an upgrade, it was a revolution. Historians later called it the world's first true submarine. And they were right. Germany finally understands the real problem. By late 1943, the technological shock was complete. Captured Allied equipment and field reports confirmed the nightmare. Centimetric radar was unbeatable with existing U-boat technology. No tactic could compensate. No bravery could counter it. No flak could stop it. Germany finally realized the truth. Only a fundamentally new category of submarine could restore parity. Thus began the frantic race to build the ELEKTROBOOT. But reality was cruel. Germany was falling apart. The idea was brilliant. The engineering was genius. The timing was fatal. The problems Germany faced: 1. Allied bombing devastated shipyards. The yards at Bremen, Hamburg, and Kiel were hammered relentlessly. Dry docks collapsed. Assembly lines were destroyed, tools, cranes, warehouses, all in ruins. Skilled labor was gone. Germany's best ship engineers were drafted to the Eastern Front, killed, reassigned to emergency weapon programs, relocated, cut off by supply shortages. Submarine construction became chaotic, improvised, fragmented. 3. Shortages were everywhere. Steel, copper, rubber, precision instruments, high-quality electric motors all became scarce. Even welding rods ran out. 4. Hitler's interference. Hitler demanded rushed timelines, unrealistic production quotas, and spread resources among dozens of miracle weapons. No weapon received the focused discipline necessary for mass production. 5. The modular construction disaster. The ELEKTROBOOT was built in prefabricated sections across multiple sites and assembled at major ports. This was efficient in theory. In practice, wartime chaos turned it into a nightmare. Sections didn't fit, alloys were inconsistent, electrical systems failed, blueprints were missing or contradictory. Engineers described it as trying to build a symphony with instruments missing. The ELEKTROBOOT launches, but too slowly. Despite overwhelming challenges, the Germans managed to complete a number of Type mine submarines. But they were plagued with defects: leaks, misaligned hull plating, faulty battery circuits, periscope failures, vibration at high speed, malfunctioning snorkel valves, unreliable trim systems. Each boat required months of repairs. Only 2 Type WWII submarines ever conducted war patrols, both in 1945, mere weeks before Germany's surrender. Neither had a chance to influence the war. The Type III, a smaller miracle. Germany also developed a coastal variant, the Type 13, a compact, fast, and capable submarine for coastal waters. It entered service earlier than the WWII, scored a handful of sinkings, and terrified Allied analysts. But it, too, arrived in 1945, far too late. Could the ELEKTROBOOT have changed the war? Naval historians still debate this question. In terms of performance, the Type WWII outclassed every Allied submarine and destroyer. In 1944 or early 1943, it could have destabilized the Battle of the Atlantic. But it would not have been enough. Why? Because the Atlantic War was no longer a contest of machines. It was a contest of system versus system, and the Allied system was overwhelming. Ultra-intelligence centimetric radar, mass-production escort carriers, long-range aircraft, industrial-scale global logistics coordinated convoy protection. A few dozen advanced submarines, no matter how brilliant, could not break this network. Germany needed hundreds. They produced dozens. Barely a handful saw action. The ELEKTROBOOT was not a weapon of salvation. It was a weapon of what might have been. The final truth: too late, too few, too broken. The ELEKTROBOOT represents one of World War II's greatest what-if stories. A submarine decades ahead of its time, created by brilliant engineers, rushed into service in a collapsing nation crippled by bombing, shortages, and chaos, unleashed when the war was already lost. It was Germany's last attempt to claw back the Atlantic. But the Atlantic was already gone. The Allies didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic because of one weapon. They won because they built an unbeatable system, and Germany tried to counter it with a miracle that arrived 2 years too late. The ELEKTROBOOT was a vision of the future, but the future could not save the present. 1944 to May 1945. Norwegian fjords, North Sea, Biscay remnants, Arctic convoys, Western approaches. By 1944, the U-boat arm was no longer a decisive force. It was a symbol, a tragic reminder of a war Germany had already lost at sea. Gone were the days of WOLFPACKS hunting across a dark Atlantic. Gone were the triumphant dispatches of coys smashed and merchant fleets burning. Gone was the aura of elite invincibility that once cloaked the U-boat corps. What remained was a dwindling collection of submarines hiding in fjords and fortified pens, commanded by exhausted officers, crewed by frightened boys, and stalked by a sky that now reigned over every ocean. The Atlantic War was dead, but the U-boats kept sailing, because the regime demanded sacrifice, not victory. This is the final chapter, a fleet reduced to fragments. At the start of 1944, Germany had lost more than 70% of its trained U-boat personnel. Its submarine yards were shattered by bombing, its WOLFPACKS were disintegrated, its code systems compromised its supply lines, collapsing its bases in France threatened by Allied invasion. And worse, the Allies owned the ocean. Every ocean. The Kriegsmarine shifted many boats north to Norway, seeking safer waters. But even the fjords, deep and silent, would not protect them. Operation Overlord forces a retreat. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 eliminated the U-boat pens at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, Bordeaux. These bases, once the steel fortresses of Germany's Atlantic War, were now isolated and encircled by land, their U-boat crews evacuated or surrendered. U-boats fled north, threading through minefields and patrol zones. Many never made it. The naval war had contracted violently. Germany's once sprawling reach at sea had collapsed into narrow pockets of shrinking refuge. U-boats, sent against D-Day, a hopeless mission. When the Allies invaded France, Dönitz ordered all available U-boats to intercept the Armada. It was a suicidal command. Centimetric radar, escort carriers, and swarms of destroyers sealed the channel approaches. No U-boat had the slightest chance of penetrating the battle zone undetected. Still, they tried. U-415 was sunk by mines. U-9988 was destroyed by escort groups. U-1191 vanished entirely. Several others were hunted down before they even reached the channel. Out of dozens sent, not one inflicted serious damage on the invasion fleet. It was the final proof. U-boats were no longer a weapon capable of shaping events. A new, younger, more desperate crew. By late 1944, the average U-boat sailor was shockingly young, 17, 18, 19 years old, barely trained, barely experienced, barely understanding the war they were entering. Veterans were rare. Most had died. Those who remained were shadows of themselves. Gaunt, hollow-eyed men who carried trauma like invisible ballast. One Allied interrogator described captured U-boat crews. They were boys wearing uniforms of dead men. A tactical shift. Night surface attacks are finished earlier in the war. U-boats relied on night surface tactics to overwhelm escorts. By 1944, this doctrine was obsolete. Why? Radar saw them instantly. Aircraft responded within minutes. Convoy escorts used radar-directed weapons. Submarines diving were still tracked. A captain wryly told his crew, "If we surface, we die. If we stay submerged, our batteries die. Choose your death." The Arctic, the last battlefield Germany shifted many surviving boats to attack Arctic convoys bound for the Soviet Union. But these waters were also lethal. Allied escorts were hardened veterans. Escort carriers patrolled continuously. Radar worked with brutal efficiency in polar air. Several U-boats scored occasional successes. But the pattern was always the same. Attack, sink one ship, be hunted, be destroyed. The cost outweighed every victory. Dönitz's final, bitter realization through 1944 to 45, Karl Dönitz continued to send U-boats into battle. But his private notes tell a different story. The boats cannot break through the Allied system. Every sortie is a sacrifice. He was ordering young men into impossible missions. He knew it. They knew it. Duty remained. Hope did not. The Titan's final tragedy. In early 1945, a small number of ELEKTROBOOT finally became operational. One, U-2511, even put to sea under Ace Commander Adalbert Schnee. On its first patrol, Schnee infiltrated a British task group undetected. He approached within firing range. He lined up the perfect shot. He could have demonstrated the ELEKTROBOOT's devastating capability, but he did not fire. Hours earlier, Germany had surrendered. The most advanced submarine of the war never had a chance to fight. A poetic tragedy that symbolized the entire collapse of the U-boat dream. The end? Surrender and scuttling. In May 1945, surviving U-boats were ordered to surface, raise black flags, surrender to Allied ships. Some captains refused. A few scuttled their boats instead. Others obeyed quietly, numb with exhaustion. In all, over 150 U-boats surrendered, lining up in Allied ports like ghostly steel skeletons of a defeated fleet. The war beneath the waves was over. A final image, the tomb of the Atlantic. By war's end, more than 3,500 Allied merchant ships, 175 warships, and U-boat after U-boat lay shattered on the seafloor, a vast underwater graveyard stretching from Iceland to the Caribbean. But only one side had collapsed completely. The U-boat arm, once feared, admired, and unstoppable, ended the war broken, outmatched, obsolete, and tragically betrayed by time. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become their tomb. 1940 to 1945, retrospective. Bletchley Park, TRE Malvern, Western Approaches Command, Coastal Command HQ. Standing at the end of the Battle of the Atlantic and looking backward, it is tempting to summarize the Allied victory as a triumph of numbers. More ships, more aircraft, more factories, more men. But this interpretation misses the heart of the story. The Atlantic was not won by numbers. It was won by knowledge. Knowledge gathered silently, processed invisibly, and applied with ruthless precision. Knowledge that blunted the U-boat's teeth long before the Allies matched them ship for ship. Knowledge that turned a chaotic ocean into a calculated battlefield. While German crews fought blind, hunted by threats they could not detect, the Allies fought with a kind of supernatural awareness. This is the real story. The fusion of technology, intelligence, and coordination that made Allied victory inevitable. Bletchley Park, the mind behind the war at sea. At the heart of the Allied intelligence machine stood Bletchley Park, a quiet English estate packed with mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, scientists, and eccentric geniuses. Their job was brutally simple: break Enigma, every day, again and again. German operators believed Enigma was unbreakable. Hitler trusted it implicitly. Dönitz relied on it to command his fleet. But the Allies, through a combination of Polish groundwork, British innovation, and American industrial computing, shattered its secrecy. The impact on the Atlantic War. U-boat patrol lines were mapped before they were deployed. Refueling rendezvous points were intercepted. WOLFPACK formations were predicted and avoided. Messages revealing U-boat damage, shortages, and even morale were decrypted. Convoys were rerouted days in advance to slip past traps. A historian once wrote, "The U-boats never understood how the convoys always seemed to get lucky. It wasn't luck, it was Bletchley." This single engine of intelligence saved tens of thousands of lives. T.R.E. Malvern, the laboratory that blinded the U-boats. If Bletchley Park was the mind, Malvern was the eyes. The Telecommunications Research Establishment, a cluster of laboratories filled with oscilloscope glow and the smell of solder, produced one of the most decisive inventions of the war: centimetric radar. The genius was not simply in inventing it, but in miniaturizing it. Small enough for aircraft, powerful enough to penetrate clouds, precise enough to detect a periscope, reliable enough to guide rockets and depth charges, mama. It turned the sky into a weapon. It turned darkness into daylight. It turned weather into an advantage. U-boat crews reported the same chilling experience. They saw us without seeing us. That was centimetric radar, the silent predator. Western Approaches Command. Coordination as a weapon technology alone does not win wars. It must be directed by strategy. Western Approaches Command, headquartered in Liverpool under Admiral Sir Max Horton, provided exactly that: real-time routing of convoys, flexible defensive perimeters, highly trained escort groups, integration with Coastal Command aircraft, rapid use of decrypted intelligence, constant evaluation of U-boat tactics. It was a military brain using modern data before the term existed. Convoys no longer wandered into danger. They were steered through invisible corridors of safety, carved by intelligence, guarded by radar, and patrolled by long-range aircraft. The sea had become a managed battle space, not a wilderness. Coastal Command, the hammer. While Bletchley and Malvern supplied the knowledge and the eyes, Coastal Command delivered the blows. Its motto, Guardians of the Western Approaches, became literal truth. Armed with centimetric radar, Lee Light's rockets, homing torpedoes, long-range navigation aids, experienced crews hardened by years of failure and slow progress. Coastal Command rewrote the rules of anti-submarine warfare. By 1944, its aircraft were sinking more submarines than all convoy escorts combined. A U-boat commander said after the war, "A single aircraft with centimetric radar was worth a dozen destroyers." He was not exaggerating. The fusion, a system so powerful it could not be defeated. The Allies did not simply add intelligence to radar to industry. They fused them into a seamless, self-correcting system. Ultra decrypts revealed U-boat intentions. HFDF radio direction finding located transmitting submarines. Radar-equipped aircraft swept the patrol lanes. Escort carriers filled coverage gaps. Coordinated escort groups attacked efficiently. Mass production replaced losses instantly. Shared intelligence flowed between Britain, the US, and Canada. Germany had no equivalent. Its intelligence was fragmented. Its radar was behind. Its industry was strained. Its commanders acted on incomplete information. Its submarines were forced to fight alone and blind. The Atlantic War was not won by a single weapon. It was won by integration, the world's first true networked warfare system. Why Germany could never catch up, even with the ELEKTROBOOT, even with late war detectors, even with new doctrines, the U-boat arm could not defeat this system. Because war had changed. It was no longer torpedo versus ship submarine versus convoy wolfpack versus escort. It was system versus system, network versus node, intelligence versus instinct. Germany was fighting 1940s battle in 1944's world. The final verdict. When historians summarize the Battle of the Atlantic, they often focus on ships sunk and submarines destroyed. But the deeper truth is simpler. The Allies won because they saw farther, thought faster, and acted as one. Germany lost because it fought alone, in the dark. Technology did not merely change the war, it changed the way war was won. The invisible edge, radar, intelligence, coordination, defeated the invisible enemy beneath the waves. Post-war analysis, 1945 to 1960. Nuremberg Archives, Allied Naval Reports, Surviving U-Boat Officers' Memoirs. When the war ended and the documents were opened, when captured technology was studied, when interrogations of U-boat captains were completed, when the dust finally settled, a sobering truth emerged. Germany never fully understood the war it was fighting. Not in real time, not even after the collapse. For a nation renowned for engineering and discipline, this was the deepest irony of all. The Kriegsmarine went to war expecting a repeat of 1917, a battle of tonnage, torpedoes, and wolfpacks. Instead, it entered the world's first war of signals, detection, computation, and coordinated intelligence, and it did so fatally unprepared. What Germany missed was not a weapon. It was a paradigm shift. Misreading the nature of war at sea, Germany believed the Atlantic would be won through better torpedoes, improved U-boat tactics, increased production, the willpower of elite crews, boldness, aggression, and doctrine. And these things did matter. In 1940, in 1941, even into early 1942. But by mid-1943, the war beneath the waves had transformed into something the Kriegsmarine had no answer for, a battle space ruled by data. Signals intelligence, radio triangulation, long-range radar sweeps, convoy rerouting algorithms, coordination between aircraft, escorts, and carriers, centralized tactical command. This was the first truly modern networked war, and Germany fought it like a duel between lone warriors. The illusion of tactical excellence. German U-boat commanders were among the most skilled submariners in the world. Their seamanship was remarkable. Their torpedo spreads, daring night attacks, and surface maneuvers impressed even Allied commanders. But excellence in tactics could not overcome blindness in strategy. A submarine ace wrote after the war, "We were masters of a game whose rules had already changed." This quote captured the entire tragedy. Germany believed superior training and individual brilliance could compensate for systemic disadvantage. But war is not chess, war is math, and the numbers were against them from the moment centimetric radar hit the skies. Overconfidence in Enigma Donitz trusted Enigma implicitly. The Kriegsmarine invested enormous faith in signal encryption. But encryption is useless if the enemy doesn't need to read your messages, only detect them. HF-DF stations, Huff-Duff, plotted U-boat transmissions through triangulation. Even perfectly encrypted signals revealed the submarine's location, whether it was damaged, whether it was coordinating, whether it was retreating. In many cases, the Allies didn't care what the U-boats were saying, only where they were saying it. Germany never adjusted doctrine to minimize radio usage. Donitz required constant updates. WOLFPACKS depended on high communication volume. This was fatal. The Kriegsmarine never grasped that the act of speaking was more dangerous than the content of the message. The fatal misjudgment of radar. Even after capturing Allied equipment, German analysts did not understand how quickly radar was evolving. Shorter wavelengths, stronger signal processing miniaturization, integration with Lee lights, pairing with rockets, homing torpedoes, and depth charge patterns. The German assumption? Radar detection at night is unreliable. The Allied reality? Radar detection at night is unstoppable. U-boat crews clung to old rules. Storm cover? Night surfacing, low visibility, long after they were obsolete. Their courage was real, but courage cannot defeat physics. Industrial blindness, misjudging the enemy's production power. Perhaps the single greatest miscalculation Germany made was ignoring American industrial capacity. Germany believed U-boat losses could be replaced. Merchant ship losses would break Britain. Allied shipyards would struggle to rebuild losses to indemnity. This was catastrophically wrong. In 1941 to 1942, Germany sank ships faster than Britain could rebuild them. But by 1943, the United States had turned shipbuilding into assembly line work. Liberty ships launched faster than U-boats could sink them. Escort carriers produced monthly destroyer escorts in continuous output long-range aircraft manufactured at industrial scale. The Battle of the Atlantic became a race of attrition, and Germany lost before it realized it was even running. The cultural blind spot, doctrine over adaptation. German naval culture prized tradition, surface rating, decisive engagements, independent captains, tactical aggression. The Allied approach was the opposite. Shared intelligence, centralized coordination, slow, methodical strategy, overwhelming force, constant technological adaptation. Germany had bold captains. The Allies had a unified system. In the end, systems beat heroes. The final misunderstanding: the U-boat was not defeated at sea. It was defeated in laboratories and code rooms. Germany believed the U-boat war was lost in the Bay of Biscay, in Black May, in convoy battles and depth charge attacks, but this was only the visible collapse. The true defeat began in Malvern, where centimetric radar was born in Bletchley Park, where messages were read in factories, where aircraft were built faster than submarines in Western Approaches Command, where convoy routes were redesigned in intelligence networks spanning 3 continents. The U-boat arm did not lose to better submarines or better ships. It lost to a better understanding of information. The legacy, a lesson for all naval warfare. Today, every Navy studies the Battle of the Atlantic, not just as a tale of bravery and tragedy, but as a blueprint for modern warfare. The lesson is timeless. He who sees first, thinks first, and strikes first wins. Germany never achieved this triad. The Allies mastered it. And so the U-boat arm, courageous, skilled, and determined, was defeated not by lack of valor, but by lack of vision. Epilogue: the silence after the storm. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the Atlantic lay calm again. The convoys sailed without fear. The escorts returned to port. The aircraft peeled away from their patrol routes. And beneath the waves, the steel bones of hundreds of U-boats rested quietly, each a frozen moment in the vast, cold memory of the sea. For the men who survived, the war never truly ended. They carried with them the sound of depth charges, the claustrophobic darkness of the hull, the taste of diesel and sweat, and the knowledge that their courage had been spent in a losing battle shaped by forces they never saw. For the Allies, victory came not from triumphalism, but from respect. Respect for an enemy who fought with skill, desperation, and unwavering discipline. But history is clear. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by those who mastered the unseen. Radar, intelligence, coordination, industry, a war of invisibles. And in a conflict dominated by shadows, the side that could illuminate the darkness claimed the ocean.